I would like to introduce our featured speaker today, Gavin Donohue. Mr. Donohue is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Independent Power Producers of New York, Incorporated, IPPNY, a statewide trade association organized in 1986 as a non-for-profit corporation. IPPNY represents operators and developers of independent electric generating facilities, power marketers, and suppliers of goods and services to the industry. IPPNY performs legislative, regulatory advocacy, and public relations services on behalf of its membership, who are engaged in the operation and development of hydropower, natural gas, oil, waste to energy, biomass, nuclear, and wind generation projects. Please welcome Gavin Donohue.
I want to thank you for the invitation. A little bit about IPNY and about myself. I come from an environmental energy background. I was the executive deputy commissioner at DEC back in the 90s when Governor Pataki was governor. So I worked a lot on acid rain deposition regulations, a lot on issues around Article 10 and power plant siting. I also was a county legislator here in Albany for 8 years. Went to college here, went to graduate school here. So I've sort of an Albanian all the way through. I came to IPNY in 2001. So I've sort of been the president here for 20 plus years. So I have a lot of experience, I think, in the energy space. We are, for those of you, and I understand my audience, you guys aren't so-called, in the energy space like I am on a daily basis, just like I'm not in the real estate market on a daily basis. I am basically the Duncan and Mike Kelly of the real estate industry for the energy industry. So I represent about 85 companies in the state. We've been around since 1986. Globally, we represent about 3/4 of all the electricity generated in the state with all fuel sources. So it's gas, nuclear, solar, wind, oil, any sort of waste energy, electricity, fuel you can think of. We support the development of power plants. We support competitive markets. We support the use of natural gas and the need of natural gas to keep the lights on. The thing that's the most important on this slide that I'd like to just tell you is we pay somewhere between $1.5 billion in property taxes. In some numbers I've seen up to as high as $1.7 billion, and we apply over 10,000 people across the state. So we are a real big economic force, I believe, in the state. Should I move this way? I also was appointed back in 2019. I was the first appointment to the Climate Council by Senator Flanagan then, who was the minority leader. So I am an appointee of the Senate. I'm on a commission of 22 people putting together this climate plan. We can talk about the structure and any questions you have later. But let me talk a little bit quickly about what the law requires and where we are. The law requires 70% of the electricity to come from renewables by 2030, 100% of the electricity be zero emitting by 2040, 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035, economy-wide emissions reductions of 85% from 1990 levels by 2050. I'm going to jump into what the law requires and what Governor Hochul has added to the law. But for those of you that are interested in this, the stat that I think is really important on this page is keep in mind that 1 megawatt of electricity deals with 1,000, can electrify 1,000 homes. So when you hear these numbers, just keep in mind what that comparison is. So the law requires, down below there's a chart, 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030, 6,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar by 2025. There's current prevailing wage requirements that are out there. We're going to need to expand the workforce and train the workforce to deal with these types of energy changes. So that was actual law. Then go to the right side of the chart. Governor Hochul came in when Governor Cuomo left and said, well, we're going to increase this to 6,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030, 10,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar by 2030. And we're also going to put prevailing wage and project labor agreements for solar projects of 1 megawatt or more to appease the labor unions. In summary, this is the most aggressive electricity decarbonization policy in the state. We far and exceed what California is doing. We always get compared to California. But my point here is to show you what 1 megawatt really is, and two, to show you how Governor Hochul has taken the law and increased it, which is going to have a huge impact on the real estate markets here in New York. So we started meeting in 2019. Well, we didn't start meeting. We started meeting in 2020, a lot of informal conversations. To be fair to the process, and I think you'll get a sense of where I am on this at the end of the presentation, let me tell you what's in the scoping plan, because some of this impacts obviously the Syracuse area, which I was happy to see, because I was skeptical that it would be included. But there's a premium put on the importance of existing hydro and nuclear facilities in the state. It's really important that those zero emission resources be maintained. We need to do more in New York State to ensure that these renewables don't disappear in the state and are strengthened. There's talk of putting a price on carbon economy-wide or just in the electricity sector. Nothing any more detailed than that, but putting a price on carbon and developing a market to achieve these goals is something that folks are interested in. The thing that I think this group is really going to be interested in is there'll be no natural gas service to existing buildings by 2027, and this is statewide. Next one, the draft plan prohibits propane, natural gas, and oil in homes in 2024. The next one prohibits new traditional heating systems in existing homes in 2030, bans the use of natural gas appliances in homes in 2035, and no gasoline vehicles in New York in 2035. What you need, if you go back up to the traditional heating systems in homes, just so you can take this away, that this means that 1 to 2 million homes.
I should have told you the shed keys were in the.
What should tell you is that 1 to 2 million homes will need to be electrified by 2030. That's a big statistic, obviously. And if we're going to get to the no gasoline vehicles sold in New York, we're going to need 3 million zero emission vehicles to be sold by 2030. Those are my statistics, or the state of New York statistics. So that's what's in the plan itself, which I thought was important for you to hear. Let me talk a little bit about what the challenges in the plan are. Keep in mind that renewable energy in New York City is only 3% of the electricity sources. Gas and oil make up more than 2/3 of the energy downstate and 1/3 of it statewide. So there's going to be monumental changes in New York City and statewide if we're going to achieve any of this. In New York City, the state power reserves are very, very thin. There is no wiggle room for hot and cold days. This month, in July, I keep my fingers crossed, because in New York City, we do have reliability problems, potentially, if we hit a big heat wave. NYSERDA says the electric buildings and vehicles will increase electricity demand by 65 to 80%. So, and if you're talking about electrifying everything that I talked about earlier, the grid build out will be 4 to 4.5 times larger as a result of these requirements. And we haven't even really talked about how we're going to do transmission yet in this state in a way that's meaningful. You need quick start zero carbon power sources. This is, in my world, there's a number of important things that I want to emphasize, but one of the biggest parts of this plan, and in my judgment, a big failure, is there is no identification of what qualifies for zero emission dispatchable technology. If in fact you want to get rid of natural gas and you have infrastructure and you want to use some different fuel, what is it? Is it renewable natural gas? Is it hydrogen? Is it green hydrogen? Is it carbon capture? All these things about what you need to keep the lights on is void in this scoping plan. And to me, that is the most important issue. If you're going to have workers that are going to run this power system in a new way in 2030, 2040, how are you going to get those workers trained? But more importantly, when you look at how much gas we use in the state, statewide, what is going to replace gas to be reliable and what they call dispatchable? The other issue is transmission and distribution will all need to be upgraded to accommodate this change. Sometimes my staff doesn't like me pointing this out, but I do in some of these talks. The Marcy South line in upstate New York. The last time we built a major transmission line in New York from upstate to downstate was the Marcy South line, and that was built in when the Berlin Wall came down. So we have gone a long, long time without building new AC or DC direct current transmission lines. That being said, we've done a good job at the local level making sure housing developments and buildings are, in malls and other places have local distribution. But I just want you to know that we're not moving electrons effectively from upstate to downstate. I'm going to talk now about the real shortcomings that I think are important to all of us here who pay taxes and electricity rates. There is no cost analysis of how to pay for any of this. If anybody asks me, oh, how much is my electricity bill going to go up as a result of this? I can't tell you. There has been no analysis of that. There is a consumer cost associated with what it's going to cost to upgrade your house to accommodate these requirements. NYSERDA has indicated that putting in the electrified buildings and taking gas and propane and other fuels out of buildings will cost somewhere between $25,000 to $50,000 per household. I don't know over how much time that is, but and what the time frame is, but that's a big number. Up to 25% of existing residents will require an updated electricity service to accommodate the electrification of the heating systems and the charging of vehicles. Something I should mention too, in the law, there is no money identified. In addition to consumers paying for this, there's no money identified as to how to pay for any of this. So we don't have carbon pricing. We don't have issues around here's how we're allocating funds. That is a big problem. So the fact that just to summarize on the shortcomings of this, we don't know what the dispatchable fuel will be to keep the lights on in a reliable fashion. Consumers aren't going to know what the costs are associated with these recommendations on their electricity bill, and there is no funding identified today to pay for it. So, and then there's something else I think is important for you to realize, which is something that is getting really not much attention at all. The law requires us on the Climate Council to consult with a group called the Climate Justice Working Group. It is statutorily created. It's a group of local advocates, and I would say most of the advocates are New York City. What this requires, once we do have funding to pay for these programs, it requires the state to invest resources to ensure that disadvantaged communities receive at least 40% of the overall benefits of the programs. Public comment on the definition of a disadvantaged community is open till July 7th. The map on your right-hand side, you will see some areas in central New York that are part of the disadvantaged communities. But what I would tell you is that all the definitions show, and what they've arrived at is 60% of the disadvantaged communities are in New York City, 14% are in the Hudson Valley, and 5% are on Long Island. I don't know, just looking at that map, you can see Western New York. You mean to tell me there's not communities that are disadvantaged? You had Adirondack Park, Finger Lake area. So this is a big deal because what it's going to do is redistribute the funds based on the definition of this community. And a lot of folks believe this is just a redistribution of wealth through the state, and is a way to just distribute funding differently. So we've had all these public hearings. I've been to many of them across the state. A public comment period closes July 1st. So it closes at the end of this week. I indicated that the disadvantaged community definition, that comment period closes July 7th. Then what I can conclude with is, we support the transition as the head of IPNI. My folks, I represent wind, I represent solar. We want innovation, we want reliability, we want emission reductions, but we also want, obviously, affordability. We want private investment, partnership with stakeholders. We want a regulatory approach that makes sense, and we want to have, good energy infrastructure and transmission projects that make sense. So let me just conclude with what next steps are. We have to, as a climate council, deliver a plan to the governor and the legislative leaders by January of 2023. So there's a lot of task force that are working that are not public task force on how to supposedly to get to the details of how we're going to do some of these things. And then the report will be giving to the legislative leaders and the governor. And at that time, they will determine what policies and what recommendations will be implemented either through let's say an executive order, a regulatory change, or legislation. So with that, I've talked quite a bit and thrown a lot at you. Let me stop and I'll try to take any questions.
Questions?
Okay.
In the chat box.
Yes, I have 4 questions that came through the chat box. The first one is 70% of electric by 2030. Question, 7.5 years from now. What percentage is currently produced by renewables?
My trusted cheat sheet here. Well, why don't we how about this? Not just renewables, what is done is attributed to zero emissions, because you have the zero emission nuclear units in Oswego. So you would say there's about 50% of zero emission electricity in New York State. Renewables, I'm going to say is about 15%. That number may be 13%, but we've got an awfully long way to go. And we're not issuing permits and building these projects quickly enough. That's one of the other problems. For us that are in upstate New York, between all the hydro we have, all the nuclear we have, we are primarily emission and carbon free. We have no more oil in upstate New York, and we have no more coal in upstate New York. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we have a statewide climate law to implement all this stuff when we're really trying to achieve, in my judgment, a lot of environmental justice, disadvantaged communities issues in downstate region versus upstate. And it's going to have a huge impact on the economy in the state.
Absolutely. Okay, we've gotten a bunch more questions, so I'll just go through the next one. Is this really possible to accomplish? Isn't what Hochul wants a little bit out of reach?
I'm not shy. I don't think we have anywhere close to meeting these goals. And I think the sticker shock of what this is going to cost consumers in light of where we are with gas prices, inflation. At the end of the day, you can put out any law or any policy you want, but you got to keep the lights on. And every politician knows you need to keep it affordable and reliable. So to me, what's troubling about the law is there's a provision in the law that will allow the PSC, if it gets too unaffordable or unreliable, the Public Service Commission can put the brakes on implementing this. But right now in New York City, for example, Con Ed had issued a year ago RFPs for storage, and you talked about storage at the beginning of this presentation. And at the end of the day, nobody was awarded any of these RFPs because the technology is not available. I mean, if you want to do dispatchable resources and use hydrogen, I don't know where we're going to get all the hydrogen to keep the lights on and make it affordable. So we're getting to the point in this process where the actual details are starting to matter, and we're getting beyond the bumper sticker conversation, because some of this stuff is just not practical in the short term. What I should add to that too, the law is silent if we don't achieve these goals. So if we don't achieve the goals, it doesn't say what the impact is on us. So I don't know really how that's going to work. What's different though is back when I worked in government, a lot of this stuff was goals, and we're going to try to achieve some of these things. This is the first time this is actually entrenched in a statute. So it is the law of the state, and we'll have to deal with it. We didn't even talk about what the electricity build out will be for buildings, what that's going to mean for businesses, and the electricity, electric vehicle build out. Because at the end of the day, most of the emissions on carbon are coming from buildings and car and transportation. Electricity sector, they beat us up over the last 20 years. We've reduced NOx by 90%, SO2 by 88%. And over the last 20 years, the people I work for have reduced carbon by 60+%, evidenced by why we have so much zero emission electricity upstate. So what we have to tackle are cars and buses, trucks and buildings. And quite frankly, I think that is an almost impossible task in the short term.
Thank you. The next question I have is, once completed, how much will our G&E bill, gas and electric bills go down? Will there be a huge decrease?
No, I have no idea. Nobody, I don't think anybody does. And if they do, they're making sure nobody knows it. So I don't have that answer.
Thank you.
That is, we need a bill impact study to make this stuff practical, and we don't have that.
Perfect. Next question. Who or what government agency are best positioned to fill in the financial gaps of this scoping plan?
Well, let's talk about electricity bills for a second. If you look at your bill, in round numbers, 70% of your electricity bill today is taxes, public policy fees, transmission and distribution costs. The other 30% is the wholesale cost of electricity and the generation of electricity. So when you look at your bill, how much is the ratepayer going to be willing to take on? I don't know how much more you can add to these bills. So I don't know if that answers your question, but billing and the impact on consumers is becoming more and more of a big issue across the state. And folks are really starting to focus on how our electricity bills are handled and what is in the electricity bill. That's why, quite frankly, we would like, as a way to build some of this new infrastructure, to have a price put on carbon and a market there to build it, but somebody's got to pay for that, and it is going to increase your bill.
Next question. How feasible are underground transmission lines?
Very feasible, but very expensive. Incredibly expensive, complicated, but it is feasible. I think you guys know better than I do. All these new housing areas all have underground transmission for the most part in housing developments, but it comes with a premium and it comes with a cost. So it's practical. It's just, again, affordability is a big issue.
Thank you. Next question. What study was done to create this timeline and goals?
Great question, because there was no study. This was driven by a group called New York Renews and Food and Water Watch advocacy groups, and some DSA leaders and Democratic Socialists out of New York City. This law was put on the books with no public hearings, no input from any experts on reliability. The New York ISO, which is tasked with bulk system reliability, is not even on the council. So this was generated by advocates, and the discussion I get when I raise issues like that are being raised here this morning is, Gavin, you're a climate denier. You're just trying to slow the plan down. And I'm like, no, you guys, if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, they don't want to talk about it. Every time I raise an issue about, let's say, dispatchable resources that are zero emitting, the answer you get is with proper planning, we can avoid all that. I don't know how that's a reasonable answer. But what I think is really important is the real estate community and all these businesses that are going to be impacted by this need to be engaged. And you know, even though the comment period closes on Friday, if you missed the comment period, I think you should still put comments in, because I'm disappointed with how far constructed this plan is without any of the real important details. And I don't suspect I'll be supporting the plan, but keep in mind, on the 22-member council, there's only 3 of us that come from any sort of part of the business. The rest are environmental advocates and environmental justice advocates. So we are outgunned at every meeting, overwhelmingly so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. How can anything happen without funds? Will it be a wait and see, or is there a plan in which we will see?
My vision of what's going to happen here is there'll be a scoping plan delivered, and the impacts that we're seeing across the world on supply chain issues and just the overall economy, some of the low hanging fruit recommendations. All I talked about was the electricity sector here today. There's a number of things that you can probably do in the ag and markets world, and farming and manure management and anaerobic digesters to control emissions. I think what will happen is they will pick the low hanging fruit stuff to look like they're actually doing something in the short term. But getting to these larger, big issues, I just don't see them being able to accomplish it. So I think they're going to pilk off the stuff that's not controversial and say, look at what we're doing. They love to write press releases. We're leading the nation in doing all this stuff. But it'll be the easy stuff, so to speak.
Perfect. I've got a couple more, or we'll keep getting questions in the chat, so I'm trying to keep up with them. Hold on. The next one is more of a statement than a question, but from somebody who lives near a nuclear power plant. As a proponent of nuclear power, this is more of a statement. It's a shame that we have built up such an energy source. So I don't know if you have comments on that.
Well, let me just tell you, because I represent everybody involved in this discussion. Indian Point was closed in Westchester County. Indian Point provided 1/3 of every day's electricity to New York City. Indian Point provided zero emission electricity and paid $75 million in property taxes and employed over 1,000 people. That's gone. Guess what we did though? We built 4 natural gas plants to increase carbon emissions to replace that electricity. So, you know, some people will sit there and scratch their head and say, was this really a good public policy? We say we want to reduce carbon, but we've got 4 new natural gas power plants in the Hudson Valley that have increased carbon. And the units in New York City that are 50, 60 years old that I represent are running at a higher rate to keep the lights on because you don't have that power. What I think is critically important is that the nuclear units in Oswego stick around. I think they provide, as many of you may know, 24-hour a day, 365-day a year, zero emission electricity. You can't afford as a state to allow that to disappear. And you can't afford to lose the taxes and the employees in Oswego, New York. So I think nuclear power is critical to the success of any program we have in the state.
Thank you. The next question is, how are homeowners going to be able to afford these changes?
Good question. You know, I think in the short term, you know, NYSERDA offers an awful lot of grant programs to homeowners to upgrade units, to promote, you know, to do energy efficiency projects. You guys should be all familiar with that, being in the real estate business. But again, as I've said repeatedly, there is no money identified to pay for this. And the money that is going to be identified, keep in mind, 40% of that money is going to go to disadvantaged communities. under the statute. So how we get there is, if I had that answer, I certainly wouldn't be in Albany, New York. I'll tell you that. So, so I don't know the answer to that.
Perfect. Next is, how are we supposed to meet these goals when we can't support the grid now on high demand days? Also, gas is a clean burning fuel. What is the big rush to get rid of it in this state?
Well, that's a good question about why we're rushing to get rid of gas. It provides an incredible resource for the state from a reliability standpoint. You know, a couple of years ago it was, let's get rid of coal. Advocates were able to get rid of coal, and that was a good thing for our environment. But now they've moved on to pick the next fuel source of gas. But at the end of the day, high electricity demand days in the months of July, we do a pretty good job keeping the lights on, but we wouldn't be able to do it if we didn't have gas. And we wouldn't be able to do it primarily in New York City without gas. So I believe today we have a very reliable electricity system. But what my issue is, and this isn't an issue for upstate New York, but in New York City, we have units that are 40 to 60 years old today. And when they're called on to run at such a high rate in the month of July or January, anything can happen at any time with these units that are that old. And we're not doing enough to repower those units, because every permit application that comes in is either denied or environmental groups come out against it. So we're actually preventing more efficiency, lower emissions, and better electricity because we're not issuing these permits. So there are some risks out there, that's for sure. But I think the ISO does a pretty good job. I think the Public Service Commission, and to be fair, the utilities do a good job to keep the lights on. It is not an easy job to keep the lights on in the state on a daily basis. But I just hope we don't have like 6 or 7 days of 95-degree heat in New York City, because then anything can happen.
Absolutely, thank you. Is this plan modeled on something done elsewhere, any other state or any other country?
They took a lot of the provisions from California. And California claims to, lead the nation in renewable generation because of their weather conditions on solar and wind. But they have many of the same requirements we have, just not in statute. But ironically enough, they haven't built these renewables quickly enough, and now there's RFPs on the street to bring back natural gas power plants because they're worried about reliability. So they actually have things out there saying one thing, but they're actually doing another. And that potentially is an outcome of what New York could do if we don't execute smartly.
Perfect. The next question is, isn't it better to try than not at all?
I agree. And my members, and again, I support and I represent wind and solar. It's just what you have to realize, all renewable resources are intermittent. So what I'm trying to say is, if you don't have the storage and you can't store the electrons, you can't run the electricity grid. So what happens is you need to have the power plant and the wind farm, because when the wind isn't generating, you have no electricity. And when ratepayers begin to realize we're paying for this stuff twice, I think people are going to be, surprised. What we need to do, instead of putting out goals just so that we say we're doing all this stuff, I didn't even talk to you about, we didn't even talk about the offshore wind stuff in Long Island. Nobody knows what that's going to cost. But why can't we transition at a pace that makes sense and impacts and enhances reliability and affordability? And all I'm seeing is that we're not doing it that way. We're just jumping into the deep end and never looking at how deep the swimming pool is. And there's practical realities here that need to be factored in that are not being considered.
Perfect, thank you. Has any politician discussed repealing or modifying the existing law to come up with something more practical that also accomplishes the same goal of zero emissions?
A number of upstate Republicans have raised this issue repeatedly, and have voted no on the law in 2019. However, as you guys all know, living in the state, New York City Democrats are really controlling the policies in the state. And I don't think that until the scoping plan is finalized and people realize what the impacts could be on cost and reliability, will there be a serious call to look at this law? Because it's just politically right now, it's two-third rail to say, oh, we can't afford it, we can't do this, and put that out there when the scoping plan isn't even finalized. So the short answer is not a lot of folks have talked about it. I've had a lot of private discussions with senators about how we're zero emission free in upstate, and there must be a way to amend the law to try to help upstate, not hurt upstate New York. And I just don't think the timing is right politically for that today.
Of course, thank you. Last couple questions that I see right now is home builders requirements of building all electric is coming up soon. What comments and feedback are you getting from our NYS home builders?
Worried about the short-term cost of building a house. And I think some home builders, I have to say, think that this is actually a good thing because it's going to increase their revenue as home builders. So if the home builders are not unified against what this is, they are mixed in how they view it. They also believe that a lot of the comments are around multi-dwelling houses and the ages of homes and how do you retrofit, 50-year-old homes that have 4 or 5 apartments in them, which is a huge issue in New York City as well. So I think the builders as a whole are all over the map as to what they're looking for in this process.
Thank you. What is just about laying unreasonable burdens on citizens, especially the poor?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the people they claim they want to help the most here are the ones that can't afford this stuff. And the impact in the inner city for low income people is tremendous. And but that conversation is tough to have because they're like, we've been, and to be fair to these folks, then there is something that needs to be done. I've been to New York City a lot for a lot of stuff. I get where they're coming from. There's power plants that have been stuck in neighborhoods, and it's just not power plants, it's salvage yards, it's all sorts of large industrial companies in low income areas, and they have health impacts that we don't have in upstate New York. And they're in really poor neighborhoods. Something does need to be done. It just needs to be done a little more thoughtfully. And we also have to realize we can't impact reliability. So the short answer is this is going to hurt the poor much more than it's going to hurt many people. So I'm concerned about that impact, but folks on the council don't seem to be as concerned about that.
Of course. Thank you so much. And then the final question of the day that I can see right now is it possible to get copies of the slide deck to send out to people that are interested in them?
Yeah, Jordan's sitting next to me. He can make sure he gets it to you folks and do what you want with it. And if you have any questions, listen, I'm the independent power producers. Feel free to go on my website, give me a call. I have a full staff here, and we do a lot of different things. I'd encourage you to go on the Climate New York work website. A lot of the comments are there. I appreciate you being interested in this. I think this is hugely important to the real estate community, and I hope I just put some light on some of these things that we're talking about in the state. So
thank you so much. At this time, there are no further questions.
okay, you guys have a great meeting, and thanks for the time.